In the early 1900s, Ignazio the Wolf Lupo was a name that commanded both fear and respect in New York's growing immigrant neighborhoods. A Sicilian immigrant himself, Lupo quickly rose to power through extortion, racketeering, and brutal enforcement of his will. His violent tactics and ruthless business operations made him one of the first major mafia figures in America, setting the stage for the organized crime empires that would follow. Lupo's story is not one of myth, but of cold, hard criminal ambition, a reality that shaped the future of organized crime in New York and beyond. Ignazio Lupo, born on March 21, 1877, in Palermo, Italy, to parents Rocco Lupo and Onofria Saietta, was a formidable figure in the early 20th century criminal underworld. From his humble beginnings in Sicily to his rise as a notorious racketeer in New York City, Lupo's story is one of ambition, violence, and eventual downfall. This narrative explores his criminal career, the scandals he was involved in, and how he ultimately faced the consequences of his actions. When Lupo the Wolf turned 18, his father set him up in a store in Palermo, where he sold high-end clothing and dry goods. According to New York police records, Lupo was already engaged in criminal activities at that time and had joined a blackmailing gang, likely connected to one of the city's mafia groups. A relative of his, Francesco Manciamelli, would eventually rise to lead one of the several Palermo cosche, or mafia clans, around 1912. In 1898, while Lupo was working in his dry goods store, a business rival named Salvatore Morello confronted him, insisting that Lupo stop undercutting his prices. Lupo refused, and according to his version of events, the argument escalated. The confrontation turned into a physical fight, during which Morello pulled out a knife. In response, Lupo drew his revolver and fatally shot Morello. After the incident, Lupo hid in Palermo for about 5 days, during which he learned that prosecution was likely. On his family's advice, he fled the country. Lupo traveled first to Liverpool, then to Montreal, and eventually entered the United States illegally through Buffalo. By the time he arrived in New York, he had been convicted in absentia by Italian courts and was wanted in Palermo to serve a 21-year sentence for murder. The Lupo family had substantial financial resources, enough to establish Ignazio in his Palermo store and help him leave Sicily on short notice. Upon arriving in New York, Lupo quickly found his footing. He initially opened a store on East 72nd Street in partnership with his cousin, Saietta. However, following a disagreement, he relocated to Brooklyn, where he began importing olive oil, cheese, and wine from Italy. By 1901, Lupo had returned to Manhattan and was operating a successful grocery store on Mott Street in the heart of Little Italy. Over the next few years, his business expanded significantly. He became the owner of a large wholesale operation at 231 East 97th Street and at least 6 retail stores. His flagship store on Mott Street, a 7-story building, was known for its high-quality food products, luxurious new delivery wagons, and an inventory exceeding $100,000 in value. It was widely regarded as the most prestigious grocery store in the Italian community, easily the most pretentious mercantile establishment in that section of the city. Lupo liked to portray his success as the result of hard work, and he did indeed work late into the evenings at his Mott Street office. According to a contemporary, another early mafioso named Zia Trestella, Lupo would constantly move between a reception area and his private office, giving orders and meeting with a steady stream of mysterious visitors. However, Lupo's growing wealth was largely due to his association with Giuseppe Morello, which gave him access to the expanding power of the Clutch Hands criminal family. In exchange, Lupo provided Morello and his associates with an ideal base for exploiting vulnerable, fearful immigrants, using the grocery business as a common cover for their criminal activities. At the time, grocery stores were a favored front for Italian criminals, a fact well known to Morello. The most feared and effective gang in Little Italy back then, led by a Calabrian named Giuseppe D'Agostino, used a network of corner grocery stores to identify potential victims. They gathered information on the financial status of local Italians, compiling details on nearly every Italian resident in the city. Once they had this information, it was easy for them to send demands and threats to their targeted victims. Joseph Petrosino, a detective, would later discover this strategy. He believed that Morello's group aimed to replicate D'Agostino's tactics and succeeded so well that the Sicilians managed to drive the rival Calabrians out of the Italian quarter within a few years. Lupo married Morello's 22-year-old stepsister, Salvatrice Terranova, in a ceremony held at St. Lucia's Church in Italian Harlem, located on East 104th Street. Morello attended the wedding and even signed as a witness. This marriage to Terranova might have been more than just a personal union. It could have been a strategic move to bind a capable man to the Morello family, and possibly solidify an alliance between Mafia factions from Palermo and Corleone. Ignazio and Salvatrice had 5 children together, 4 daughters, starting with Onofria in 1906, and a son named Rocco, who would later join his father in the family business. The couple remained married for over 40 years. By 1903, Lupo's grocery business was thriving, rapidly expanding beyond Little Italy to include locations in Italian Harlem and Brooklyn. Both business and criminal opportunities seemed limitless. Wealthy customers became targets of Black Hand extortion letters. Lupo's wholesale operation, which supported his retail stores and supplied Italian food and wine across the city, was also a tool for extortion. Many independent grocers were coerced into paying inflated prices, and soon realized the risks of switching to more affordable suppliers. Initially, these threats were subtle, but they soon escalated to violence. Lupo's tactics often started with poisoning the valuable teams of dray horses that grocers relied on for deliveries. From there, the intimidation advanced to bombing stores and even homes. One shopkeeper, Gaetano Costa, a butcher in Brooklyn, was murdered in his store after refusing to pay a $1,000 extortion demand. Another victim, Salvatore Manzella, who sold Italian wines and foods on Elizabeth Street, was driven into bankruptcy after enduring 4 years of relentless extortion. Unlike some others, Manzella survived long enough to testify, revealing that Lupo frequently visited him, forcing him to sign blank receipts and delivery notes, which Lupo then filled in and cashed as he saw fit. By the early 1900s, Lupo's power and influence in New York City's criminal underworld were solidified. Recognizing the benefits of a united front, he merged his Mafia faction with the Morello-Terranova faction. This strategic alliance led to the formation of what became known as the Morello crime family, a dominant force in organized crime in New York City. Lupo maintained his leadership over his Little Italy-based interests, sharing the overall leadership of the newly formed Morello crime family with Giuseppe Morello. While Lupo operated from Little Italy, Morello controlled his base in East Harlem. The merged crime family included various members such as Morello's half-brothers, who led affiliated groups and managed rackets. Key enforcers like Charles Ubriaco and Tommaso the Oxpeto played crucial roles in enforcing the family's will and maintaining its dominance through violence and intimidation. Lupo insisted on complete loyalty from his crew, going so far as to kill a relative he suspected of being a traitor. His fearsome reputation was such that Italian immigrants would often cross themselves whenever his name was mentioned. Lupo's victims, estimated to number at least 60, primarily included individuals targeted by Lupo's Black Hand for refusing to pay, as well as rivals from other gangs competing with Lupo and the Morellos. These victims were taken to a location known as the Murder Stable at 323 East 107th Street in Italian Harlem, where they were tortured. Despite the frequent screams heard in the area during the night, which terrified local residents, police investigations were rare. The victims were often killed and buried on the premises. Counterfeiting was a key part of the Morello family's operations, although by this time, they were very cautious of the Secret Service and aware of the risks of printing fake currency in Manhattan. Morello decided it was safer to send the printing plates to Italy, where counterfeit money could be produced away from the scrutiny of William Flynn, the new head of the New York Bureau. The challenge of smuggling the counterfeit bills back into the United States remained, but Lupo's successful wholesale business provided a solution. By 1902, Lupo was importing large quantities of wine, olive oil, and foodstuffs from Italy, and his shipments, arriving at Manhattan piers, underwent only minimal inspections by customs agents. Morello arranged for the counterfeit bills to be hidden inside gallon olive oil cans. This approach quickly proved effective. Over $10,000 in forged notes were smuggled into New York and circulated in various cities, including Pittsburgh, Yonkers, and several others. The Clutch Hand had learned from the events of 1900 and had reorganized his gang to ensure complete secrecy. The organization was now composed entirely of Sicilians, from the street-level operatives to the senior mafiosi handling the distribution of money. Morello and Lupo minimized their involvement to avoid leaving any incriminating evidence that could lead authorities to them. This strategy proved effective. The key members of the Morello family remained undetected. When Vito LaDuca was arrested in Pittsburgh with 2 street-level pushers and a stash of the boss's counterfeit $5 bills, he managed to secure his release within a week, while the pushers were held for trial. To prevent any leaks or potential betrayals, the Clutch Hand dealt with this with ruthless efficiency, making it clear that only the weak or extremely reckless would consider betraying him. The Clutch Hand's determination to protect himself was starkly demonstrated in the summer of 1902. The gruesomely mutilated body of a Brooklyn grocer, Giuseppe Catania, was found on the East River shore at a place known as Dead Man's Cove. Catania, a robust Sicilian known for his strength, had run a store on Columbia Street through which Mafia counterfeits were distributed. Likely introduced to the Morello gang by Lupo during Lupo's brief time in Brooklyn in 1901, Catania had been missing for 2 days before a group of boys found 2 large potato sacks near the waterline. Curious, they opened the sacks with their pocket knives. One sack contained blood-soaked clothes, while the other held Catania's lifeless, naked body, bound with rope, with his ankles pulled tightly against his lower back and his body nearly drained of blood. The police investigation into Catania's murder quickly stalled, mired in theories about old vendettas from Italy and disputes with acquaintances. Despite Catania's wife and 6 children insisting he had no enemies, and the case briefly capturing front-page attention, it faded from the headlines within a week. The police eventually suspected Mafia involvement, but without concrete evidence or arrests, the case remained unsolved. It was left to the persistent William Flynn to uncover the true motive behind the murder. Flynn discovered a year later from informants in Little Italy that Catania had a penchant for drinking and was prone to talking too much while intoxicated. The Clutch Hand had learned of these indiscretions and decided that a mere warning was insufficient. When Catania was last seen in Manhattan shortly before his murder, he was with Lupo the Wolf. The brutal nature of Catania's death, his near decapitation, and the deliberate sealing of his body in sacks meant to be discovered, was a clear message from Morello to his organization. Any sign of weakness or lack of discipline would lead to inevitable death. The Catania murder effectively eliminated one potential leak in the Mafia's counterfeiting operation, ensuring that issues with individuals talking while drunk or revealing secrets were resolved. This was evident at the end of 1902 when several members of Morello's ring were caught in Yonkers, just north of New York, while passing counterfeit bills. The arrested individuals, Isidore Crocevera, Giuseppe Di Primo, and Giuseppe Giallombardo, were typical low-ranking members of the Morello gang. 2 of these men, Di Primo and Crocevera, had only recently arrived in the United States. The trio were convicted of passing counterfeit bills on March 13, 1903. That weekend, Lupo, Vito Casciofero, and nearly all of the Morello gang were seen meeting in the back of their Prince Street saloon. The Secret Service had planned a sting operation against them, equipping an informant with marked bills to buy counterfeits from the gang. 11 search warrants were prepared for raids on various locations, but the operation was delayed on April 13 when an unfamiliar individual joined the gang. Morello and Casciofero were observed having a serious conversation before escorting the stranger to the back of a butcher shop at 16 Stanton Street. The next morning, Around 5:30, a woman heading to work discovered a suspicious barrel on East 11th Street. When she looked inside, she was horrified to find a male corpse. The police found that the body had been nearly decapitated by a deep knife wound. The Secret Service identified the victim as the stranger they had seen in Morello's company the previous night. 5 days after the murder, the police caught a lucky break when an anonymous letter aided in the identification of the barrel murder victim. The letter claimed the dead man had arrived in New York to help secure money owed to the recently imprisoned Giuseppe Di Primo. Detective Petrosino visited Sing Sing prison, where Di Primo recognized a photo of the victim as his brother-in-law, Benedetto Madonia. The next day, Petrosino moved on to Buffalo to interview Madonia's wife. She declared her husband had been a member of a secret society and had traveled to New York to assist Di Primo. Morello was promptly arrested as he walked along the Bowery, while Lupo was taken from his home, where a substantial amount of correspondence was seized. Vito La Duca, who had been released due to insufficient evidence in the recent Pittsburgh counterfeiting case, was captured in a tenement near the Stanton Street butcher shop. Over a dozen arrests were made, but Caciofero could not be found in the city. Lupo was ultimately released due to insufficient evidence. After the trial, he was rearrested in connection with a 1902 counterfeiting case. On Thursday, April 30, 1903, he was indicted by a grand jury and held on $5,000 bail. The charge stemmed from a September 18, 1902, incident when Lupo had sent a letter to Canada that contained a single counterfeit $5 bill. The charges, however, were later dropped. By 1906, it was clear that the Mafia posed a major threat to law and order in New York. The chief of police believed that the Morello Lupo organization was responsible for approximately 50 murders. Despite this, Lupo came up with the idea of capitalizing on the booming construction market in the city. Since the Morello family's illegal operations alone couldn't generate enough funds to build entire tenement blocks, Lupo orchestrated the sale of shares in a newly established construction company and arranged mortgages on suitable properties. This led to the creation of the Ignazio Florio Cooperative Association among Corleonesi, incorporated on December 31, 1902. The real Ignazio Florio, a wealthy shipping magnate from Palermo with ties to the Mafia, likely remained unaware of the fake association bearing his name in America. Initially, the cooperative had a modest capital of $1,200, and Lupo was not listed as a director. The company was led by Antonio Maloney, a fellow Corleonean, with Morello as treasurer and a board of other prominent Sicilian community members in Little Italy. The cooperative focused on acquiring inexpensive land in the city's outskirts. Its primary goal was to fund the construction of Italian tenements on 137th and 138th Streets and Cypress Avenue in the Bronx, completed by 1906. Other projects included lots on 80th Street, 109th Street, and Beach Avenue. The largest development being a row of tenements at 140th Street and Lenox Avenue, financed by $120,000 in mortgages at the end of 1905. The buildings were sold upon completion. Morello and Lupo had no interest in managing rental properties. Between 1905 and 1906, they secured $336,000 in mortgages for various construction projects, creating pressure to make the share issue successful. With $198,000 in stock available at $100 per share, they sought investors beyond Little Italy, finding many in the broader criminal network. By 1907, stockholders spanned the country, reaching as far as the Mississippi Valley and the Gulf of Mexico. However, the 1907 financial panic severely impacted the Ignazio Florio Cooperative. Falling land and property prices led to significant losses, and by summer 1908, the association defaulted on its obligations. The recession also affected other parts of the Morello empire, including Lupo's grocery chain. Struggling with unpaid suppliers and cash flow issues, Lupo's solution was to sell goods at a loss. When auditors examined his Mott Street stores, they found assets worth only $1,500 against debts exceeding $100,000. Lupo's troubles were further highlighted in October, when Sergeant Joseph Petrosino publicly confronted him. The police had learned that Lupo, in financial desperation, had resumed crude extortion tactics, accompanied by severe threats. The new investors in the Ignaz Florio cooperative soon faced financial trouble as their investments began to vanish. The need for additional funds became increasingly desperate. Ignazio Lupo, fleeing from his creditors, made a final defiant move by ordering $50,000 worth of groceries on credit and arranging for them to be shipped to a warehouse in Hoboken, New Jersey. The plan was for these goods to be sent to Sicily for sale through his former associates in Palermo. However, Sergeant Petrosino traced the paper trail, intercepted the shipments, and had them seized, blocking Lupo's attempt to generate illicit cash. By the end of October 1908, the Morello family had reverted to their counterfeiting operations. In 1909, Sergeant Petrosino planned a covert mission to Palermo, Sicily, aiming to leverage a new federal law that allowed the U.S. government to deport any alien convicted of a crime abroad if they had been in the country for less than 3 years. Armed with a comprehensive list of known Italian criminals residing in the U.S., Petrosino intended to gather evidence of their criminal backgrounds to facilitate their deportation. However, there were already indications that the mission's secrecy and success were at risk. For instance, just weeks before Petrosino's departure, when the New York Times inquired about his whereabouts, Police Commissioner Theodore A. Bingham gave an ambiguous response. "He may be on the ocean bound for Europe, for all I know." On March 12, 1909, upon arriving in Palermo, Petrosino was lured to a nighttime meeting in Piazza Marina to receive information about the Mafia. While waiting for his informant, he was ambushed and shot in the face by 2 attackers. Reports indicate that Petrosino managed to return fire before he succumbed to severe bleeding and collapsed. An Italian sailor who heard the gunshots rushed to help him, but Petrosino was already beyond saving. As soon as news of Petrosino's murder spread, Sicilian authorities were inundated with a massive influx of letters and phone calls offering theories and information. These came from across Italy and the United States, amounting to thousands of pieces of correspondence. Baldassare Ciola and his team meticulously reviewed each letter, but only took 3 seriously. All 3 were from New York and included 2 anonymous letters from someone with detailed knowledge of the Morello gang's operations, and a 3rd letter postmarked Brooklyn, written in Sicilian dialect but likely by someone born in New York. The letters, when combined, offered a partial picture of the events. The first letter, sent on March 13th, just after Petrosino's murder was reported in Manhattan, claimed that the killing had been ordered by Morello, Lupo, the Terranova brothers, Giuseppe Fontana, and other mafiosi. The second letter, sent 2 days later, named additional Morello family members and stated that Cassio Ferro had been responsible for planning the murder. The third letter, the only one to mention Carlo Costantino and Antonio Passananti by name, identified them as the actual assassins of Petrosino. The exact reason for Lupo's return to New York in the fall of 1909 remains unclear. While Lupo claimed to have been unsettled and working for his brother in Hoboken, and to have been unable to pay his debts due to extortion from a Black Hand group, Flynn suspected he was simply tired of hiding out. Regardless, Lupo soon reappeared in Little Italy, resumed many of his old activities, and hired lawyers to handle his financial troubles. He also continued to visit Highland to check on new batches of counterfeit money. The Secret Service agents tasked with following him were instructed to avoid detection. Lupo was arrested without incident on January 8, 1910, while walking near his home. He was found with only a nail file and $7 in cash. He joined Giuseppe Morello and 9 other prominent members of the Morello gang in jail. Bail was set at unprecedented amounts. Unable to raise these sums, the mafiosi remained in custody. Lupo and Morello were eventually sentenced to 30 and 25 years respectively and imprisoned at the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta. In 1920, Lupo was paroled, and in 1922, Morello was paroled. Meanwhile, Giuseppe Masseria and Salvatore D'Aquila, who had been prominent underlings in Morello's organization, had risen to significant power. By the time of the Mafia's General Assembly held between June and September 1921, Salvatore D'Aquila, now the boss, took action against his rivals. During the meeting, Lupo and Morello were denounced as dangerous traitors and condemned to death. The death sentences handed down by the Mafia extended not only to Morello and Lupo, but also to several of their followers. While Lupo was serving out the conditions of parole, he wanted to visit Italy, but the Parole Act prohibited him from leaving the country. In 1922, President Warren Harding granted Lupo a conditional commutation of his sentence, lifting the restrictions imposed by his parole. The 1922 annual report of the Attorney General noted Lupo's wish to return to Italy and pointed out that his co-defendant, Giuseppe Morello, had received a commutation. The former chief of the Selective Service assessed that Lupo's level of culpability was comparable to Morello's and thus recommended a commutation for him as well. Due to the death sentence imposed on the duo by the Mafia, they fled. The fleeing mafiosi, including Umberto Valenti, were next seen in Sicily around October 1921, seeking refuge and assistance. They spent about 6 months hiding in and around Palermo. During this period, they reached out to Nicola Gentili, hoping he could help them resolve their troubles. In 1922, Morello relinquished all claims to his former position and the leadership of his family, formally acknowledging D'Aquila as the new boss, and the death sentences against them were revoked. As a result, Morello, Lupo, and Valenti returned from Sicily in the spring. However, Masseria and D'Aquila were vying for power in New York during the 1920s, leading to a violent rivalry. During this period, Masseria recruited Lucky Luciano as one of his gunmen. After being ousted from his role as boss, Morello allied himself with Masseria. In an attempt to regain favor with D'Aquila, Valenti targeted Morello. Soon a war ensued, resulting in significant violence and several high-profile deaths among the mafiosi involved. In August 1922, Valenti was killed by gunmen loyal to Masseria. Some sources suggest that Luciano may have been involved, either as part of the group or possibly acting alone. Later, during the Castellamarese War from 1930 to 1931, Masseria and Morello fought against a rival faction based in Brooklyn, led by Salvatore Maranzano. During this conflict, Morello served as Masseria's war chief and strategic advisor. Giuseppe Morello and Joseph Periano were among the first casualties of the war, killed on August 15, 1930, while collecting cash receipts in Morello's East Harlem office. In the early 1930s, the leaders of the National Crime Syndicate summoned Lupo for a meeting and pressured him to abandon most of his rackets, retaining only a minor Italian lottery operation in Brooklyn. The syndicate preferred bribery over Lupo's reliance on violence and intimidation, which they felt attracted too much attention. In 1936, Governor Herbert Lehman petitioned President Franklin D. Roosevelt to have Lupo return to prison for widespread racketeering. Lupo was sent back to Atlanta to complete the remainder of his original sentence. He served only a few years, and upon his release in 1946, was in a senile state with only days left to live. He returned to Brooklyn, where he passed away quietly in 1947 at the age of 69. The Morello crime family, once led by Giuseppe Morello and Ignazio Lupo, laid the foundation for what would later evolve into one of New York's most powerful mafia organizations, known as the Genovese crime family. Through years of internal power struggles and strategic alliances, their legacy endured, shaping the future of organized crime in America.